So, our essential question for pretty much this entire chapter: how do different organisms obtain and use energy to survive in their environments? We talked about a long time ago, way back in chapter one, what it takes to make a living thing, what it means to be a living thing. Excuse me. And one of those things is to be a living thing, you have to obtain and use energy. Among other things, you're made of cells, you reproduce, you grow and develop, things like that. But one of them is you have to be able to capture and use energy. So we're talking about this chapter is about the different ways that organisms do that. So this section is about photosynthesis. Photosynthesis produces sugars that store chemical energy. And this is a process that you have hopefully heard before, going all the way back to elementary school. It's a process that is done by plants, takes energy from the sun, turns it into sugar. Good morning, Vincent. So, producers are organisms that produce their own source of food, not like cook it like we do, but actually within their own cells produce food. So, they're also called autotrophs. The prefix auto means self. If you're writing an autobiography or writing a story about yourself, and then troph translates to nutrients. So, they're making these nutrients for themselves. An example is plants, but plants aren't the only organism that are considered producers or autotrophs. In aquatic or marine or water biomes, a lot of the time it's algae. Algae are like water plants, but they're not quite plants. And photosynthesis is a process that captures energy from sunlight to make sugars. Just the basic definition. The equation of photosynthesis. So, this is why we save chemical equations for 4.1, is because in 4.2 and 4.4, we go over specific chemical reaction equations. So on the left are our reactants. 6 CO2 is just 6 molecules of carbon dioxide plus 6 H2O. We all know what H2O is, plus 6 molecules of water. And then sunlight kind of goes at the top in parentheses, just means kind of in the presence of sunlight. Last week, when we talked about chemical reactions, we used heat as kind of the catalyst for the chemical reaction. Photosynthesis uses sunlight as the catalyst for this chemical reaction. So the chemical bonds between the carbon dioxide and the water, they break and they rearrange themselves to make a bigger molecule. C6H12O6 is the chemical formula for glucose, which is the sugar that is made during this process. And 6 molecules of oxygen, which is the plant's waste product that they just put back into the air, fortunately for us, because that's what we need to live. So you will eventually have questions on the equation of photosynthesis. And remember, if I ask you to write an equation or a chemical formula, it should always be the numbers, the letters, the symbols, the arrows. So that is the equation of photosynthesis in just 3 different ways: the equation form, the written out word form, so you know what each of those mean, and then just the pretty picture form with the leaf, the sunlight, the carbon dioxide, and the water going in, and then the glucose and the oxygen coming out. Glucose is what they actually use for food, and then oxygen is the waste product that they just emit into the air. Chloroplast, like we said with the bellwork, this is where photosynthesis happens. We talked about how plant cells have chloroplasts. It is the organelle in plant cells where photosynthesis happens, or algae, or other photosynthetic bacteria, prokaryotes. But plant cells is the main one, especially on land. So chloroplast is the organelle. It contains a pigment called chlorophyll. Now, pigments are what give things their colors. So chlorophyll is the pigment that makes plant cells green, or that makes plants green. Our pigment is called melanin. If you have a lot of melanin, you are darker. If you have a little bit of melanin, your skin is lighter. Carrots have pigment called beta carotene. It's what makes it orange. So you got to remember these words are similar, but chloroplast is the organelle, chlorophyll is the pigment that makes the plants green. The structure of a chloroplast. So just like when we broke open a cell and we looked at all the bunch of stuff in it, there's a bunch of organelles and stuff. Apparently, we've learned how to break open a chloroplast, and there's a bunch of stuff inside the chloroplast as well. And so if you bust open a chloroplast, it has these little stacks of coins inside, and it has its own liquid inside as well, kind of like the cytoplasm in the cell. But grana are the stacks of coin-shaped compartments, and then thylakoids are the individual coins. And it's all stuck inside a jelly-like fluid called the stroma that keeps everything in place. And different parts of photosynthesis happen in these different parts of the chloroplast, which is why it's important to name them and figure out what they are. There's two phases of photosynthesis. Like I said, they happen in different parts of the chloroplast, which we'll talk about. There's the light dependent reactions, which is the first phase, and then the light independent reactions, which is the second phase. And the light independent reactions have a few different names. It could be called the dark reactions because it's independent of light. It doesn't actually need light, so it can happen in the dark. Or sometimes it's called the Calvin cycle, which is just named after the scientists that figured it out. So Calvin cycle is usually the most common, but it's easier to compare light dependent to light independent when we talk about it at first. So the light dependent reactions, first thing that has to happen, the chlorophyll, that pigment that makes it green, captures energy from sunlight. And there is a whole chemical explanation for how this is done. We do not go over it. We just know that the chlorophyll is the actual molecule that captures the pigment from sunlight, or captures, the energy from sunlight. So in other words, these reactions depend on how much sunlight the plant gets. These reactions cannot happen if there is no light, because it depends on the light. This phase takes place in the thylakoids, the little coins, and both water and sunlight are needed for this process. And this process also requires energy in the form of ATP. Then the light independent or the dark reactions, these take place in the stroma, the jelly-like fluid. And we take the other reactant, which is carbon dioxide, or we don't, the plants do. Plants take carbon dioxide and use it to make sugar. So it basically takes the two reactants. One of the reactants goes through light dependent reactions. The other reactant of the chemical equation goes through the light independent reactions. And like I said, this is independent of light. So it doesn't need it. It happens whether there's light or not, whether the sun is out or not.